Petro Oleshchuk is joining our broadcast, a political analyst. Peter, hello, we're glad to see you.
Hello.
Let's talk about the fact that Putin is going to the parade to see Xi Jinping, and apparently he's supposed to bring Kim Jong Un with him. Could you please tell us, what does this gathering of dictators in one place mean? I'll also add some general information. Robert Fico is expected to be at the parade, as well as the president of Serbia, Alexander Vučić. For those who don't know, Fico is the prime minister of Slovakia. Alexander Lukashenko, of course, who calls himself the president of Belarus, will also be there, along with the president of Iran, the president of Indonesia, and the speaker of the National Assembly of South Korea. So what does all this mean? Could you please explain?
The faces of evil, the axis of evil, all gathered together. You know, much like in the classic and highly acclaimed comedy film Austin Powers, where the notoriously nefarious Dr. Evil would meticulously gather together all of the world's most formidable supervillains and then carefully seat each and every one of them around a single imposing table, all in accordance with their respective ranks and evil affiliations. Well, you know, in a very real and profound sense, this scenario is truly a remarkable crystallization of precisely what we have long and consistently referred to as the infamous and deeply concerning axis of evil. But most of the time, the term axis of evil is used as a sort of journalistic phrase, as in there's supposedly some axis of evil that opposes the free world and so on and so forth. But in actual reality, it's not merely just a figure of speech, it's an undeniable concrete fact. And it's a profound reality that, in point of fact, all these significant figures clearly and deeply feel, experiencing it firsthand. And it's obvious that they really are ready to act as a kind of united front. And Fico's presence here is, of course, the most interesting fact, since Slovakia is a member of the European Union and, most importantly, a member of NATO. That is an organization that, in theory, is supposed to contain the influence of this so-called axis of evil, but for some reason isn't really doing so. And the significant presence, in fact, of prominent figures like Robert Fico among the various NATO leaders clearly shows that NATO and the Western alliance as a whole truly have some rather serious and pressing problems. So yes, the axis of evil is uniting, consolidating, while Trump, let's put it this way, isn't exactly destroying Western unity, but is constantly putting it into question and under threat. And from here, a question arises. Yes, the question is what in fact will happen in the future when this very axis of evil, which has a single goal, what actually unites all these people? They are very different from different parts of the world, and it would seem they have nothing in common. Opposition to the West. In other words, they hate the West, they want to destroy it, they want to destroy democracy and its associated values, and for the sake of this, they are willing to unite with each other despite fundamental differences in many respects. And isn't this a reason for the West to reflect what in fact awaits it tomorrow?
Honestly, when I read this list, I double-checked to make sure. The Speaker of the National Assembly of South Korea, Woo Won-shik. So wait, South Korea, does that mean they will be sitting next to Kim Jong Un? Is that normal now? But what about South Korea, the Western world, best friends, chewing gum, helping Ukraine with artillery shells and all that? Or is there something else here?
They didn't help Ukraine with artillery shells, they sold some of the shells to the United States. So since this is a fundamental position of South Korea, they do not provide Ukraine with military or any other kind of assistance. And there was some kind of humanitarian aid, but that was under the previous government and the previous president who, well, held more, let's say, right conservative positions. But now the former president of South Korea is on trial. The newly elected president is left-wing, probably one of the most left-leaning presidents in South Korea's history. He came to power with the idea of resetting relations with North Korea, with the help of Russia, by the way. In other words, his program includes establishing good relations with Russia and China so that they can help South Korea reset and improve relations with North Korea so that they can have peace, friendship, and harmony. Personally, I think this is the height of absurdity in the current situation when North Korea is becoming as militarized as possible with Russia's support, improving its own missile production technologies, testing its army in real combat conditions, and in general is genuinely preparing for war. But at the same time, South Korea is having this sort of leftist episode, which is reflected, among other things, in actions like these and in attempts to sit on two chairs at once. They won't be able to truly pull it off, but in actual reality, this is quite a profoundly dramatic and significant story. especially considering the crucial and expansive role that South Korea currently plays overall in the broader Western world as a prominent bearer of cutting-edge technology, a recognized leader in advanced, innovative methods and sophisticated production tools.
So, Dr. Piotr, let's sum it up. The key point for us is that Putin will meet with Xi Jinping, and their buddy Kim will also be there. And together they need to develop some kind of common position on Trump. Because after that, Trump will meet with Xi Jinping, but only after this meeting. So tell me, what do you expect? Well, not exactly provocations, but what conditions or demands do you think China will put forward to Trump when he meets with Xi Jinping?
Well, China's strategic interest, of course, is that Russia should not leave China's sphere of influence under any circumstances. In fact, the continuation of the current war against Ukraine is part of this plan. That is, the war goes on, there is no reset, Russia continues to separate itself from the West, and accordingly orients itself toward China. And in principle, everything is going perfectly for China in this regard. And naturally, Trump, with his ideas of resetting relations with Russia and ending the war in Ukraine as soon as possible, probably doesn't quite fit into these plans. But at the same time, China may not openly contradict Trump's plans. I think China might simply enjoy manipulating this topic, giving Trump hope. As practice shows, there's no real basis for believing that Trump will be able to win Putin's friendship and that Putin will switch from being friends with China to being friends with Trump. But in reality, it's obvious that China is manipulating this. And we see how, from time to time, there seem to be some breakthroughs in relations between Russia and the United States, but then all of it is quickly disavowed, and the whole process starts over again. In essence, we see how China, using Russia, is playing a cat and mouse game with the United States. It's as if they're constantly giving hope that a reset is just about to happen and then rolling everything back again. It's hard to say whether any stable agreements between China and the US are possible in this situation. Because on the one hand, China is not interested in any kind of economic escalation with the United States, but it's clear that China has its own plans, which ultimately still come into conflict with the interests of the United States. But Russia here is not an independent factor, and we can see that very clearly. And by the way, all attempts to somehow reset relations between the United States and Russia fail precisely because of this. That is, the United States obviously does not quite correctly assess the extent of Russia's involvement in the Chinese geopolitical project.
Piotr, there's something else I'd like to discuss with you. The attack on Kyiv that took place last night. Let me remind our audience that already 20 people have died, well, 19. They are also reporting that people are still being searched for under the rubble. Therefore, unfortunately, it is clear that the statistics may get worse. Let's hope that doesn't happen. So, this night was very frightening. The Russians once again launched missiles, drones, and everything else they could. In Russia, this attack was called a success. That is, military targets and the like were hit. Keith Kellogg, Trump's envoy on the Russia-Ukraine war, responded, saying that this is supposedly how the Russians see peace. So, at least it's good that he pointed that out. But still, is Trump actually capable of doing something after this, changing his position, making adjustments? Or will we once again see something like, oh, Vladimir makes me so angry. Vladimir, why do you make me so angry? You've killed so many dozens of Ukrainians in the center of Kyiv. What is your assessment and forecast?
It's telling that only Keith Kellogg responded, and even then, not right away. At the same time, we should understand that Keith Kellogg is not an official government figure. He's not the Secretary of State, not the Vice President, not a member of the administration. He is, let's say, a representative of Trump in a public capacity. So yes, he can probably communicate with Trump and tell him things, but that's about it. But all the official structures of the United States did not react at all. Today, I spent the whole day checking the United States Embassy in Ukraine's page on X, and they didn't post anything at all. Nothing. In other words, they completely ignored it. Although you would think if there was ever a time to respond, it's now. So it's clear that they are continuing down the path of silence and ignoring the issue. And it's obvious that Trump will act in the same way. Honestly, I don't know whether he'll comment on this now or not. Maybe he doesn't plan to comment at all and will just go play golf over the weekend. So honestly, it doesn't look like there will be any response from the United States. In other words, Trump believes he's already reached an agreement with Putin, and now it's just a matter of formalizing it. Let others handle the formalities. But in reality, statements from Russia, particularly what Lavrov has been saying lately, indicate that Russia does not believe it has reached any agreements with the United States. At all, in general. By the way, today Peskov also emphasized that there were no agreements on a ceasefire in the skies. So really, what's the problem? We are continuing military operations. This is quite an unambiguous challenge to the Trump administration, but Trump is not going to respond to it. In other words, Trump believes that a deal is close, that it's just a little bit more, just a little, and everything will be settled. And accordingly, he will proceed from this very paradigm. That is, he won't do or say anything. So once again, if we hear anything, it will just be some vague, meaningless statements.
All right, let's discuss one more thing before we finish. There was a statement that, for example, the Hungarians are now very eager to sue the European Union in order to overturn the decision to provide aid to Ukraine from the funds that were frozen by the European Union, I mean Russian assets. Tell me, this figure Orban, can he actually influence such decisions right now? And how is his position shifting at the moment? At one point, he was extremely angry with Zelensky after the shelling of the Druzhba oil pipeline, and then there were reports that the European Union managed to persuade Hungary not to veto, for example, Ukraine's accession to the EU. So, as of now, please comment on Orban and his influence.
For now, for the time being, Orban is clearly hoping to achieve his goals solely through blackmail and exerting pressure. In other words, he hopes that by showing his strength now, so to speak, Ukraine will back down, and he will continue to maintain excellent relations with Russia, receiving money, oil, and everything else Hungary needs from Russia, while at the same time blocking any decisions in the European Union that are important for Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine has a different opinion, and accordingly, the strikes on the Druzhba oil pipeline will continue. For now, Sijarto claims that they have supposedly found some kind of workaround. Well, if this workaround is also eliminated, then sooner or later Hungary will face a choice. Either continue escalating with Ukraine or try to find some kind of compromise with Ukraine. Honestly, I don't know which path the Orban government will choose, but in any case, it's clear that Ukraine has finally found the button, pressing which can actually influence Orban. That is, many times people have tried to persuade Orban to negotiate with him to solve certain problems. But all of that was useless, because in any case, Russia could always offer Orban more. That was the only thing Orban cared about, who would give him more, and Putin always gave more. Accordingly, trying to deal with Orban in a good way didn't work out. Let's see what happens, so to speak, if we try the hard way. So far, the results seem encouraging to me, because the hysteria that broke out in Orban's government shows that in reality this is very, very painful for them. If they don't find a way to rein in Ukraine in the near future, then one way or another, I think they'll have to enter into some substantive negotiations with Ukraine on the question of essentially how to coexist going forward and how to resolve the problems that exist. In reality, Ukraine doesn't need much from Hungary, just that it doesn't block the process of European integration, doesn't block the allocation of aid to Ukraine, and doesn't block anti-Russian sanctions. So in fact, none of this directly concerns any Hungarian financial or other interests. This is simply what Orban promised Putin in exchange for that same oil and other privileges. And accordingly, if Orban stops receiving Putin's oil, then what reason does he have to serve Putin's interests? So, well, I think this story isn't over yet. There will be many more episodes in this whole situation. So we'll just have to see, well...
We'll keep an eye on this. And now let's, at the very, very end, discuss the position of Merz, who recently stated, Friedrich Merz, that Ukraine's capitulation is merely an opportunity for Putin to prepare for a new war with Europe. Tell me, please, do you currently see a clear position from the European Union on this issue? Or let me put it this way. To what extent does Friedrich Merz's position currently resonate with the majority of decision makers in Europe?
Well, you see, in Europe, as always, is not united. That is, there will always be someone in Europe who opposes a unified position. We've already mentioned Orban, we've mentioned Fico, and there are other countries as well, other governments where there are also rather controversial figures. And because of this lack of unity, Europe cannot play the role of a global political actor. Because on the face of it, there are resources, there is money, and the demographics allow for a claim to the status of a world power. But in reality, it does not have the status of a world power. Why is that? Because there is no unity. That's why naturally Merz's position is important, because one way or another, Germany is still the leading country in Europe. Whether anyone wants to admit it or not, there is no more significant economy, no more significant military-industrial complex. Germany is Germany. What more is there to say? And the leader of Germany, accordingly, is not exactly the leader of Europe, but rather the leader of Europe. That's why naturally his position is significant. But we have to understand that in Europe, there are too many forces that are not interested in Europe having its own agency. And secondly, disunity always works against Europe actually playing the geopolitical role that it can and should count on.
Thank you very much. Petro Oleshchuk, political analyst, was on air with Ukraine Today. All the best to you, Petro. Take care of yourself. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.